The sting of the insult didn't come from a shout. It came from the silence. It came from the way the man across the table looked at Victor Hale, not as a partner, not even as a rival, but as a piece of furniture that had stayed in the room far too long. Victor sat in the deepest corner of Le Saphir, a restaurant where the air was thick with the scent of hand-rolled cigars and the heavy, oaky breath of vintage Bordeaux. The lighting was curated to hide secrets, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to pool around Victor's chair. Only his hands were visible, resting on the white linen like two weathered stones. Specifically, his left hand. Across the back of that hand, stretching from the knuckle of the middle finger down to the pulse of the wrist, lay a thick, jagged ridge of pale flesh. A scar. To a stranger, it was a disfigurement. To Victor, it was a map. It was the physical record of the year he turned 30, the year his first partner, a man he had called brother, stripped the company accounts bare and vanished into the night, leaving Victor with nothing but a mountain of debt and this permanent mark from a shattered glass desk. He felt it now, a faint, rhythmic itching, a dull throb beneath the surface of the skin. His thumb moved instinctively, my hold firmly along the length of the ridge. It's waking up, he thought. The ghost is restless. The heavy doors of the restaurant swung open, and the atmosphere shifted. The scent of expensive, aggressive cologne, something with too much musk and not enough soul, announced the arrival of Silas Vane. Silas was 37, polished to a mirror shine, and radiating the kind of confidence that only belongs to those who have never had to rebuild anything from the ashes. He walked toward the table with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room as if he already owned the deed to the building. When his gaze finally landed on Victor, it didn't stop at his face. It dropped, with a visible flicker of disgust, to the scarred hand on the table. Silas didn't sit. Instead, he pulled out his phone, holding up a single finger, the universal sign for you are not as important as this call, and turned his back. For 2 full minutes, Victor sat in the silence of his own insignificance, listening to Silas laugh about a golf handicap with someone named Robbie. Finally, Silas slid the phone into his pocket and turned around. He still didn't sit. With 2 fingers as if he were handling a piece of medical waste, he pushed a sleek black leather folder across the table toward Victor. "Victor," Silas said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any genuine warmth. "The 90s called. They want their business model back." He finally took a seat, leaning back so far he was almost horizontal, his expensive watch catching the amber light. "Look at yourself. You're sitting here hooting that old scar like it's a lucky charm. It's not. It's a warning. You've been holding on to that company like it's a holy relic, but in this market, it's a corpse, a beautiful mahogany-scented corpse. And I'm the only one offering you a dignified burial." Victor didn't look up. He looked at the folder. "Sign the documents, Victor." Silas' voice dropped, becoming a heavy, oppressive weight. "This isn't a negotiation. This is an act of mercy for a legend who doesn't know when to leave the stage. Sign it now, and you can retire to a beach somewhere. If you don't, well, the banks aren't as sentimental as I am. They'll start with the equipment. Then they'll take the office, and eventually, they'll put that little garage where you and your wife started under the hammer. I'd hate to see her memory sold to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar." Inside Victor's chest, a cold fire ignited. The mention of his wife felt like a blade twisting in an old wound. He looked at the black folder. "If I sign this," he thought, his thumb pressing so hard into the scar that the skin turned white, "I am erasing her. I am telling the world that the 20 years we spent building a life meant nothing more than a payout for a shark in a $3,000 suit." But if he didn't sign, the creditors were circling. The social sadism of the industry was already beginning to freeze him out. He felt like an old lion, backed into a corner by a hyena who knew exactly where the lion was weakest. "Why does this scar hurt so much today?" Victor whispered, almost to himself. Silas laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. "Because it's the only part of you that still knows how to feel the truth, Victor. You're done. Pick up the pen. Let the future take over." Victor's fingers reached for the folder, but his heart felt like it was being squeezed by an icy hand. The internal stakes were no longer about money. They were about the ghost of his wife, the weight of his legacy, and the terrifying realization that he might be about to commit the final betrayal of his own life. The tension at the table was a physical thing, a thick, invisible shroud that seemed to repulse the very air. Silas leaned back, crossing his legs with a flourish that screamed entitlement. He didn't look at Victor. He looked through him, his eyes already calculating the commission he would earn once this relic finally surrendered. Then she appeared. Her name was Katya, and she moved through the heavy atmosphere of the sapphire like a quiet, dark flame. Her skin was a deep, rich ebony that seemed to absorb the amber glow of the chandeliers, a striking contrast to the starch-white crispness of her server's vest. She carried a bottle of red wine with a practiced, effortless grace, the kind of grace that comes from 15 years of navigating rooms filled with people who didn't want to see her. Silas didn't even pause his monologue as she approached. He was mid-sentence, lecturing Victor on modern synergy and disruptive pivots, his hands flying through the air in wide, theatrical gestures. As Katya leaned in to pour the wine, her movements precise and respectful, Silas made his move. It wasn't an accident, it was a calculated display of dominance. Just as the dark liquid began to flow, Silas jerked his elbow outward with a sharp, jagged motion. The wine splattered. A few dark, blood-like droplets hit the pristine white linen. One landed on the edge of the black folder. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he slammed his palm onto the table, the silver cutlery rattling in a frantic metallic chorus. "Are your eyes in your heels, girl?" Silas hissed. The venom in his voice was cold, sharp, and intentionally loud. A few heads at neighboring tables turned. Katya froze, the wine bottle still in her hand, her expression a mask of professional calm, though her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the glass neck. "Look at this," Silas continued, pointing at the spill with a trembling finger of staged outrage. "Look at the skin. It's so dark, I'm surprised you can even see the stains you're making. Who let someone like you into the VIP section? You belong out on the curb with a broom, not touching a table where real business is being conducted." He turned back to the foreign partners sitting just a few feet away, men in slate-gray suits who watched the exchange with impassive, icy eyes. Silas let out a short, jagged laugh, switching to their native tongue. "Forgive the help," Silas said, his voice dripping with a casual, oily mockery. "It's hard to find good servants these days who aren't as dim-witted as they are. Colorful, but don't worry. We're working with a man who's half senile and a girl who's half blind. This will be over in 5 minutes. He's ready to roll over." Victor felt a surge of nausea. He understood the tone, if not the exact words. He looked at Katya. She was kneeling now, dabbing at the wine with a cloth, her head bowed. But Victor saw her eyes. They weren't broken. They were listening. "Anyway," Silas snapped, turning back to Victor and switching back to English, his face instantly transforming into a mask of false concern. "As I was saying, our partners are being incredibly generous. They just told me, and I'm translating directly here, Victor, that they see unprecedented potential in your legacy. They want you to stay on as a chairman emeritus. They want to protect your name, Victor. They're offering you a seat at the high table for the rest of your life." He leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're basically saying they want to make you a god in your own industry. All you have to do is sign. Don't let a clumsy waitress and a little spilled wine ruin the greatest deal of your life." Katya's hand paused on the table. She was inches away from the folder. She heard the lie. She heard the jagged gap between the silk of Silas' translation and the iron of the partner's actual words. The social sadism was peaking. Silas wasn't just trying to take Victor's company. He was trying to strip him of his dignity by making him a party to the humiliation of another human being. He wanted Victor to nod, to agree to join him in the gutter of his own arrogance. Victor's thumb hurt, the scar harder. The itching was now a burn. He looked at the pen Silas had placed on top of the folder. It looked like a harpoon. They really said that?" Victor asked, his voice thin, feigning a frailty he didn't quite feel. "Every word, Victor," Silas lied, his smile widening to reveal rows of perfectly white, predatory teeth. "Every single word." The air in the room felt heavy, like the moments before a summer storm when the birds go silent and the sky turns a bruised, unnatural purple. Silas was humming a low, rhythmic sound that vibrated with a terrifying sort of triumph. He reached into his inner vest pocket and withdrew a fountain pen. It was heavy, gold-plated, and caught the light with a predatory glint. Tuck. He clicked the cap. Tuck. He taps the tip against the black leather of the folder. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The sound was a metronome of psychological execution. It was the ticking of a clock, counting down the final seconds of Victor Hale's autonomy. Silas leaned in, his face so close to Victor's that the older man could smell the expensive gin on his breath. "Are you shaking, Victor? Is that the hand that built an empire? Or is it just the cold realization that your time is up?" Silas whispered, his voice a jagged edge of mockery. Aye, sign it. Don't be a coward at the finish line. Don't let them remember you as the man who died in a rented garage, clutching a handful of dust while the world moved on without him. Below the edge of the table, Katia was still dabbing at the spilled wine. Her movements were slow, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. But her mind was a whirlwind. She heard them. The men in the slate-grey suits were not impressed. They were not generous. They were leaning back, their voices a low, guttural murmur that Silas assumed was safe behind the wall of a foreign tongue. "Look at the old fool," one of them whispered. "He's actually listening to Silas. He has no idea that Section 4.2 strips him of every patent, every royalty, every cent of the intellectual property he spent 30 years creating. We'll buy the shell for $1, and by tomorrow morning he'll be a trespasser in his own office." The other man chuckled. "Silas is a magnificent snake. Tell him his bonus is doubled if the ink is dry before the main course arrives." Katia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. She looked up, her gaze catching the reflection of Victor's face in the polished mahogany of the table leg. He looked hollow. His thumb was haunting that scar with a desperate, frantic energy, his skin white and bloodless. In that moment, Katia didn't see a wealthy businessman. She saw her grandmother. She remembered 15 years ago, the small, cramped apartment, the smell of eucalyptus and old books. She remembered the day she had to walk away from a university linguistics scholarship because her grandmother's lungs were failing and there was no one else to pay the bills. "Never forget, my child," her grandmother had rasped, clutching Katia's hand with a strength that defied her frailty. "Words are the skin of the truth, but they are not the truth itself. Learn the languages of the world, not to impress the powerful, but to protect those who cannot hear the lies being whispered in the dark." Katia looked at Silas. He was the embodiment of every social sadist she had ever served, the men who thought her skin color and her uniform made her invisible, a part of the background noise. To him, she was a dim-witted convenience. To him, Victor was a senile obstacle. The internal stakes in Katia's heart surged. If she spoke, she would be fired before the sentence was finished. She would be blacklisted from every high-end establishment in the city. She would lose the steady income that kept her life afloat. But if she stayed silent, she would be an accomplice to a murder. Not the murder of a man, but the murder of a legacy. She saw Victor's hand move. His fingers, trembling and aged, closed around the gold pen. He began to lower it toward the signature line, his eyes clouded with a weary, soul-crushing resignation. "Tuck." Silas gave one final arrogant tap on the folder. "The world is waiting, Victor. Make your choice." Katia took a breath. It was a deep, chest-expanding breath that felt like it was drawing in the strength of every ancestor who would have been told to keep their head down and their mouth shut. She stood up. She didn't move away. She stepped closer. The wine bottle in her hand felt heavy, not like a tool of service, but like a gavel. She set it down on the table with a sharp, resonant that cut through the low music and the hum of the room like a gunshot. The sound of the wine bottle hitting the marble tabletop, that sharp, crystalline cement. So P didn't just break the silence. It shattered the carefully constructed theater of Silas Bain's deception. Victor's hand, with the gold pen hovering a mere hair's breadth above the signature line, froze. The nib trembled, a tiny bead of black ink beginning to bloom like a dark, poisonous flower on the expensive parchment. Silas didn't look at Katia at first. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. He simply tightened his jaw, his eyes fixed on the contract. Sign it, Victor. Don't let the clumsy help distract you again. The Katia didn't move. She stood tall, her ebony skin glowing with a fierce, sudden radiance under the chandelier. She didn't look at Silas. She looked directly into Victor's wary, grey eyes that were searching for a reason, any reason, to stop. "Mr. Hale," Katia said. Her voice was low, melodic, but it possessed a vibration that cut through the air like a cello string. "Put the pen down. Do not let that ink stain a lifetime of honorable work." The room seemed to tilt. Silas spun around, his face contorting from a mask of oily charm into a snarl of pure, unadulterated venom. He lunged halfway out of his chair, his finger stabbing the air inches from Katia's face. "Shut your mouth, you pathetic low-life waitress!" He screamed. A social sadism had finally stripped away the suit and the cologne. This was the real Silas, the man who saw people as tools or trash. "Who the hell do you think you are? You know nothing about business. You know nothing about these men. You're a servant, a tray carrier. I'll have you blacklisted from every street corner in this city before you can finish your shift. Get out now." He turned the masturade, snapping his fingers frantically. "Security, get this woman away from my table." But Victor Hale had finally stopped Miant, his scar. His thumb was still, resting on the ridge of pale flesh. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Katia. There was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there all evening, the clarity of a man who had spent 30 years reading the souls of others. "Let her speak, Silas," Victor said. His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of a mountain. "Speak?" Silas laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "Victor, she's a lunatic. She probably thinks she's in a movie. She's trying to extort us. Or she's just—" "I said," Victor repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "Let her speak." Katia didn't flinch. She ignored Silas' trembling rage. She leaned closer to the table, her voice steady and rhythmic. "The man sitting across from you, Mr. Hale, the one in the slate-grey suit who has been smiling so politely. He just whispered to his associate that Silas is a magnificent snake. He said that Section 4.2 of that document strips you of every patent and every cent of your intellectual property. He said that by tomorrow morning you will be a trespasser in your own office." The blood drained from Silas' face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out of his throat. Katia continued, her gaze never wavering. He said, and I quote directly from his tongue, sir, that the old fool is so blinded by his own fear that greed and desperation will make him sign his own death warrant. They aren't offering you a seat at the table, Mr. Hale. They are offering you the crumbs from a meal they stole from your kitchen. A chill moved through Victor, colder than any winter he had ever endured. He looked at the partners across the room. They were no longer smiling. They were staring at Katia with a mixture of shock and predatory fear. They realized too late that the background noise in the room had been a witness. You understand their language?" Victor asked softly. "My grandmother taught me that truth often hides between the words people think no one else can hear," Katia replied. "I studied linguistics for 3 years, sir. I've spent 15 years listening to the secrets people spill over half-empty wine glasses. I know exactly what they said." Silas found his voice again, but it was thin and desperate. "She's lying. She's making it up. Victor, look at her. Look at where she is and look at where I am. Who are you going to believe? Your business partner of 5 years, or a girl who clears away dirty plates for a living?" Victor Hale looked at the black folder. Then he looked at Silas, who was sweating through his $3,000 suit. "In 30 years, Victor said, his voice as cold as iron, I've learned one thing. When a man panics this quickly, it's because the light has finally hit the nest of roaches he's been hiding. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a suffocating, pressurized void, like the moment before a dam bursts. Silas Vane was no longer the polished predator. He was a frantic animal, his chest heaving, his eyes darting toward the exit. Victor Hale moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist. He simply reached out and took the gold pen from the table. Silas let out a jagged, hopeful breath. That's right, Victor. Don't listen to the help. She's a nobody, a fluke. Sign it, and we can get her fired together. We can... Victor didn't sign. He gripped the black leather folder with a sudden, explosive strength that seemed to draw from the very marrow of his scarred hand. He ripped the document in half. The sound of tearing parchment was like a bone snapping in the quiet room. Yip. He didn't stop. He tore the halves into quarters, then eighths. Then Victor Hale stood up. He was 56 years old, but in that moment he stood with the terrifying, upright stature of a man who had rediscovered his soul. He took the handful of shredded white confetti and slowly, almost mockingly scattered the pieces over Silas' head. They fell like snow onto his expensive shoulders, drifting into his gin glass, coating the magnificent snake in the wreckage of his own greed. "Silas," Victor began. His voice was a low rumble that made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. "You were right about one thing. I am an old man. I am slow. I am sentimental. And I have spent too many years hurting this scar, waiting for the world to forgive me for my failures." He stepped around the table, leaning in until his face was inches from Silas' sweating forehead. But even a toothless lion can still smell the rot of a hyena. "You have a $3,000 suit, Silas, but it can't mask the stench of the soul that's been decomposing since the day you decided that people were nothing more than numbers on a ledger." He turned his gaze to the partners in the slate-gray suits who were now standing, their faces pale masks of panic's calculation. Victor spoke a single sharp sentence in their language. His accent was rough, but his intent was lethal. The men recoiled as if they had been slapped. They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They turned and fled the restaurant, their footsteps echoing like a retreat in the marble hallway. Victor turned back to Silas. He was trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. "You said I should retire to a beach, Silas?" "No. I think I'll stay. I think I'll spend my golden years ensuring that every bank, every firm, and every boardroom from here to the coast knows exactly what kind of mercy you offer. You wanted to auction off my wife's memory. Well, I'm going to auction off your reputation. And I promise you, Silas, the opening bid will be 0. The psychological execution was complete." Silas looked down at the shredded paper in his lap. He looked like a man who had just watched his own funeral. "One more thing," Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "You marked Cartier's skin. You said it was too dark to see the stains. But you were wrong. Her skin is the only thing in this room that isn't covered in the filth of your lies. You have a beautiful suit, Silas, but your character is more tattered than a beggar's rags. Now, cut. Get out of my sight before I decide that mercy is a word I no longer wish to practice." Silas didn't say a word. He stood up, the shredded contract falling from his lap like dead leaves, and he stumbled toward the door. He didn't look back. He vanished into the night, a ghost of a man who had lost everything to a girl with a wine bottle and an old man with a scar. Victor stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling. The itching in his hand had stopped. The scar felt cool. He turned toward Katia. She was still standing there, her posture unbroken, her expression one of quiet, dignified victory. "Mr. Hale," she said softly. Victor looked at her, and for the first time in 10 years, he smiled, a real, weary, beautiful smile. "Katia," he said, "I believe I've lost my appetite for dinner, but I find I have a sudden, desperate need for the truth. Please, sit down." The restaurant had returned to its curated hum, but the air around table 12 remained electric, a sanctuary of hard-won truth. Silas was gone, a ghost exorcised by his own greed. The foreign partners had vanished into the city's indifferent arteries. Victor pulled out the chair Silas had occupied. He didn't beckon. He invited. "Please, Katya." The hierarchy of this room died the moment you spoke. "Sit with me." Katya hesitated for a heartbeat. She looked at the maître d', who stood paralyzed near the wine cellar, then back at Victor. She sat. She didn't sit like a servant granted a favor. She sat like an equal who had just held the line. "Why?" Victor asked, his voice thick with a quiet, gravelly wonder. "You heard Silas. He's a man who burns bridges for warmth. You risked your livelihood, your safety, your very future. For an old man you've never met. Why?" Katya looked at her hands, the deep ebony skin glowing against the white tablecloth. "Because I have spent 15 years behind that wine bottle, Mr. Hale. 15 years watching men like Silas carve up the world as if it were a carcass. I have seen them laugh at the senile, mock the weak, and erase the invisible." She looked up, her gaze steady and piercing. "My grandmother used to say that silence is a luxury the honest cannot afford. She spent her life scrubbing floors so I could study the languages of the world. She didn't do it so I could watch a legend be dismantled by a lie. I didn't save you because you are a legend, sir. I saved you because I could not live with the version of myself that stayed silent." Victor felt a lump in his throat he hadn't felt since his wife's funeral. He reached out, not to touch, but to gesture toward her. "You have spent 15 years serving tables, Katya, but you have been a scholar in the shadows. You studied linguistics?" 3 years, she said, a flicker of wistful pain crossing her face. "Until my grandmother's lungs grew tired. Responsibility became my primary language after that. I traded the classroom for the dining room because love demanded it, but I never stopped listening." Victor leaned back, his thumb tracing the scar on his hand, not in anxiety, but in reverence. "Success. We spent our 50s realizing it's a deceptive metric. We think it's about the patents, the glass offices, the signature on the bottom line. But tonight I realized that success is measured by the people we are brave enough to lift along the way." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pen, the one his wife had given him when they opened that first rented garage. It wasn't gold. It wasn't flashy. It was honest. 3 months from now, Katya, my company will be undergoing a radical transformation. I don't need a translator who only moves words from one mouth to another. I need a conscience. I need an international communications advisor who can hear the truth hidden between the lines. Someone who understands that integrity is the only currency that doesn't devalue." Katya's breath caught. "Sir, I am a waitress. The world doesn't have a place for people like me in those boardrooms." Victor leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a newfound fire. "The world has exactly the place we carve out for it, Katya. And I am tired of boardrooms filled with magnificent snakes. I want a voice that carries the weight of the truth. I want a voice that Silas Vane could never silence." 3 months later, the Grand Hall of the International Trade Center was a sea of flashing lights and expensive suits. At the podium stood a woman whose presence commanded the room before she even spoke. Her skin was a deep, radiant ebony, set against a sharp, midnight blue suit that spoke of power and poise. To her left sat Victor Hale. He looked younger. The weight on his shoulders had shifted from a burden to a foundation. He watched Katya know. "Director Katya," she addressed the assembly of global leaders. "Honesty," Katya's voice rang out, amplified and unshakable, "is often mistaken for a quiet virtue. But in a world built on the noise of deception, honesty is the most violent act of rebellion there is." Victor smiled. He looked down at his left hand. The scar was still bare, a jagged ridge of history. But it no longer itched. It no longer burned. It was a badge of a man who had been saved not by a contract, but by a conscience. Never ignore the quiet voice of truth. Sometimes wisdom doesn't arrive in a $3,000 suit. Sometimes it arrives wearing a simple uniform, holding a bottle of wine, and a courage that can move mountains. The world will tell you to keep your head down. It will tell you that your color, your job, or your past defines your worth. But the world is a Silas Vane. And you are the truth. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Speak, because someone, somewhere, is waiting for your words to save them. The camera pans to the back of the hall, where a young server is pouring water for a guest. She looks up, hears Katya's voice, and for the first time, she stands a little bit taller. Victor's hand rests on the table, still and strong. Beside it, Katya's hand holding the folder of a new, honest partnership. The cycle of light continues.